Picture this: a modern superpower, spread across a continent, still run by a written constitution that has been in operation since 1789, described on the U.S. Senate's civic history pages as the world's longest surviving written charter of government. That's the United States. And no, that outcome wasn't inevitable. It wasn't destiny, or geography, or some secret American gene. It was a string of high-stakes decisions, some brilliant, some messy, stacked on top of each other, until a brand new republic existed on paper and then had to exist in real life. So, where did this begin? Start with the strange setup. For more than a century, Britain's North American colonies are both loyal subjects and chronic improvisers. They're far from London, forced to solve problems locally. And over time, they build local assemblies and local habits. An everyday assumption that we decide things here, even while they still fly the British flag. Then the bill arrives. After costly imperial wars, Britain tightens enforcement and tries to raise more revenue in North America. And the colonies push back not just about money, but about who gets to decide. Britain says, "Pay up." The colonists say, "Sure, show us the vote." Britain says, "No." The colonists say, "Then watch what happens." On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence, formally announcing a break with Britain. But the declaration isn't only a breakup letter. It's also a claim about legitimacy. It argues that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that people have the right to alter or abolish a government that becomes destructive of their rights. In other words, it's not just we want out, it's here's the principle that makes getting out make sense. Of course, announcing independence is easier than running a country. Breaking away creates a new problem. How do you turn 13 quarrelsome, cash-strapped political units into one workable machine? The early system proves too weak, and the young nation lurches from crisis to crisis. So in 1787, delegates meet to draft a new framework. And the U.S. Constitution is signed on September 17, 1787. It is ratified in 1788 and becomes operational in 1789. That's the pivot point and the big American bet. You don't build a country around one person, you build it around a mechanism. Now here is the twist that drives the next 2 centuries. That mechanism is powerful, but it's also packed with tension. Here is where the American story turns from new idea into unstoppable motion. Once the Constitution is running, the country does what growing countries do. It expands. Fast forward to 1803, and the United States buys a massive chunk of North America from France, the Louisiana Purchase, for $15 million. If you're thinking, wait, you can just buy land the size of a continent? Yes, that's exactly the vibe. Napoleon says, "You want New Orleans?" The Americans say, "Yes." Napoleon says, "How about half the map?" The Americans say, "Do you take checks?" But here's the twist. Expansion doesn't just add land. It forces one explosive question to the center of politics over and over again. Will slavery expand into the new territories or not? That argument isn't a side plot. It becomes the plot. By 1820, Congress tries to manage the tension with the Missouri Compromise, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to preserve balance. It's basically a political duct tape solution, and duct tape works until you keep pulling on it. Meanwhile, every new territory is a fresh match. By 1854, Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, repeals the Missouri Compromise, and reopens the national struggle over slavery in the Western territories. So now the question isn't just moral or economic, it's procedural. It's about who gets to decide. And the country starts treating politics like a zero-sum survival game. Then the Supreme Court pours gasoline on the fire. In Dred Scott v. Sandford, decided March 6, 1857. The court's majority opinion states that enslaved people were not U.S. citizens and that Congress lacked authority to ban slavery from a federal territory. If you are hoping for a legal final answer that cools things down, this is the opposite. It convinces many Americans that the system itself is being bent and that compromise is running out of road. So why does that matter? Because once people stop believing a shared system can contain the fight, they start looking for exits. In December 1860, South Carolina issues its Ordinance of Secession on December 20, 1860. Fast forward a few months, and the abstract conflict becomes literal artillery. In April 1861, Confederate forces bombard Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. And with that, the United States stops being an experiment you can argue about in pamphlets and becomes an experiment you fight about with armies. The Civil War doesn't just decide who wins a battlefield. It decides what the country even is. In the middle of the war, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, declaring that enslaved people in the rebellious states are, and henceforward, shall be free. It's a wartime measure with limits, but it flips the meaning of the conflict. The fight is no longer only about preserving the Union. It's now also about freedom. And it changes what the United States will be allowed to claim about itself afterward. Fast forward to the war's collapse. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee meets Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse to discuss surrender terms. That moment becomes shorthand for something bigger. The Union survives, but at a horrifying cost. And the country now has to rebuild its politics, its economy, and its social order without pretending the core contradiction never existed. Here's the twist. Ending the war doesn't automatically end the argument. The mechanism has to be updated. Congress passes the 13th Amendment on January 31, 1865, and it is ratified on December 6, 1865, formally abolishing slavery nationwide. That's the legal line in the sand. But law is a starting gun, not a finish line. After 1865, the United States enters a long, uneven era of rebuilding, trying to define citizenship and rights in practice, not just on parchment, while the country's economy starts accelerating like it just found a hidden gear. Meanwhile, the U.S. industrializes hard. In the decades after the Civil War, the United States emerges as an industrial giant, with old industries expanding and new ones like petroleum refining, steel, and electrical power growing rapidly, while railroads knit the country into a national market. So the story is now running on two tracks at once. One track is the struggle over who fully belongs in the democracy, and the other track is a booming industrial system that turns the U.S. into a different kind of power, less like a small republic on the Atlantic edge, and more like a continental engine. The Constitution is the operating system. The Civil War is the emergency patch. Industrialization is the moment the computer suddenly gets 10 times faster, and now everybody argues over who gets the admin password. Fast forward again, because once the U.S. becomes an industrial engine, it's only a matter of time before global shocks drag it onto the world stage. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and the next day, the United States is fully pulled into World War II. When the war ends, the U.S. doesn't just go home and go back to normal. It helps build a new international rulebook. The UN Charter is signed on June 26, 1945 in San Francisco. Then, as tensions with the Soviet Union harden into the Cold War, the U.S. formalizes a strategy of support and containment. The Truman Doctrine notes a request to Congress on March 12, 1947, asking for $400 million in assistance for Greece and Turkey and framing a policy that would guide U.S. foreign policy for decades. And on April 3, 1948, the Marshall Plan is signed into law to help rebuild Europe's economic infrastructure. Here is the twist. The same mechanism that helped the U.S. survive its early chaos rules, institutions, checks, arguments, forced into procedures also becomes its permanent pressure cooker. The country grows by fighting over what those rules mean, then updating them, then fighting again. Which brings us back to that opening detail. A modern superpower still anchored to a centuries-old written framework, constantly stressed, constantly argued over, and somehow still running. If you want the next speed run, comment the country or the era and I'll do it the same way. Weird detail first, then the chain of causes that made it inevitable.